For nearly a year, a former enslaved man ruled an entire colony. In 1763, Cuffy commanded an army of thousands, controlled almost every plantation in Berbice, and brought the Dutch Empire to its knees. European soldiers cowered in coastal forts, while African warriors moved freely through the land, burning what they wanted, freeing who they chose, and building their own government in the ruins of slavery. The Dutch sent desperate letters begging for help from neighboring colonies. They offered Cuffy negotiations and treaties. For 11 months, the impossible happened. The enslaved became the masters. But Cuffy's rebellion was just one chapter in a much longer war. For over 200 years, groups of escaped enslaved Africans called Maroons fought a guerrilla war against Dutch and British colonial powers in the jungles of Guyana. They built hidden villages deep in the rainforest. They launched raids that terrified plantation owners. They created their own societies with their own laws and leaders, and they never surrendered. This is the wild history of how the Guyana Maroons turned the deadliest jungle on earth into their fortress and waged a war for freedom that would last for centuries. To understand how the Maroons came to fight the Dutch and British, we need to start at the beginning, before there were Maroons, before there was slavery, when this land belonged to people who'd lived there for thousands of years. The coast of Guyana sits on the northeastern edge of South America, wedged between Venezuela, Brazil, and Suriname. It's a land of massive rivers, thick rainforests, and swampy coastlines that flood when the tide comes in. Long before any European arrived, indigenous peoples had made this place their home. The Arawak people, also called Lakono, lived along the coast and rivers. They were farmers and fishermen who built villages and grew crops like cassava. Further inland lived the Carib people, known as Colonial, fierce warriors who controlled huge territories and defended them violently. Even deeper in the mountains and dense forests lived the Akawayo, Patamona, and Wapishana peoples. These nations knew how to survive where the jungle was so thick you couldn't see the sky, where rivers crashed down rocky cliffs, and where dangerous animals hunted day and night. Each indigenous group had its own language, leaders, and way of life. The land provided everything they needed: rivers full of fish, forests full of animals to hunt, good soil for growing food. Life was hard, but it was their life, built over thousands of years. Then the Europeans came, and everything changed. In 1498, Christopher Columbus sailed past the coast. He saw brown muddy water flowing from the Orinoco River and thought he'd found paradise. He hadn't, but his arrival marked the beginning of the end for indigenous people's freedom. The Spanish came next, searching for gold and a mythical city called El Dorado. They explored rivers and fought with Carib warriors, but the land defeated them. The coast flooded constantly. Diseases killed their soldiers. The jungle was impossible to cross. So the Spanish mostly gave up and left. But they left behind something deadly. European diseases like smallpox and measles spread through indigenous communities. People who had no immunity died by the thousands. Entire villages disappeared. Knowledge that elders carried for generations was lost when they died. The indigenous population was devastated before the real colonization even began. The Dutch arrived in the early 1600s with different plans. They weren't looking for gold. They wanted to make money through trade and farming. In 1616, the Dutch West India Company set up the first permanent European settlement on the Essequibo River. They built trading posts in small forts. At first, they traded with indigenous peoples. The Dutch gave them metal tools, cloth, and guns. Indigenous peoples gave them food, showed them the land, and sometimes worked for them. It wasn't friendship, it was business. But indigenous peoples were slowly being pulled into a European system they never wanted. Everything changed when the Dutch discovered how much money they could make from sugar. By the 1640s and 1650s, sugar plantations in Brazil and the Caribbean were making people incredibly rich. Sugar was more valuable than almost anything else in Europe. Everyone wanted it. But growing and processing sugar required brutal, dangerous work that killed people. It needed huge numbers of workers. The Dutch tried to enslave indigenous peoples, but it failed. Indigenous people knew the land too well. When they escaped, they vanished into the jungle where Europeans couldn't find them. European diseases also kept killing indigenous workers. The Dutch needed workers who didn't know the land, who couldn't easily run away, who could be controlled through violence and fear. So they turned to the transatlantic slave trade. By the 1650s, European nations had been stealing people from Africa for over 150 years. The Dutch West India Company had slave trading posts along the west coast of Africa, in places that are now Ghana, Togo, Benin, Nigeria, and in the Congo and Angola regions. The people kidnapped from these places came from advanced civilizations. The Akan kingdoms were famous for gold work and had complex governments. The kingdom of Dahomey had organized armies. The Congo kingdom had cities that amazed early European visitors. These weren't primitive people. They were farmers who understood advanced agriculture. They were metalworkers, weavers, traders, artists, musicians, healers, and warriors. They spoke dozens of different languages. They had spiritual beliefs that connected them to their ancestors in the land. They had families, children, and futures. All of that was violently stolen. Many Africans were prisoners of war sold by enemy kingdoms to European traders. Others were kidnapped by raiders who worked with Europeans. They were chained together and marched to the coast, sometimes walking hundreds of miles before they even reached the ocean. Those who survived were locked in slave forts, stone prisons built by Europeans on the African coast. Then came the nightmare of the Middle Passage, the ocean voyage to the Americas. Enslaved Africans were packed into cargo holds like objects, not people. They were chained so tightly they couldn't sit up or move. They lay in total darkness in their own waste for 6 to 8 weeks. Disease spread fast in these terrible conditions. Dysentery, smallpox, and fever killed dozens of people on every voyage. Some refused to eat, choosing death over slavery. Others broke free and jumped into the ocean, drowning themselves rather than face what was coming. Ship captains expected about 20 to 30% of captives to die during the voyage and simply accepted it as part of doing business. The ships that reached Guyana carried sick, traumatized people who had been turned into property. They were sold at docks in places like Fort Island on the Essequibo River, Fort Nassau in Berbice, and markets in Demerara. Families were ripped apart, husbands sold away from wives, children torn from mothers. People who had been respected in their communities, doctors, priests, warriors, farmers, were now listed in record books next to farm animals and tools. Their names were erased and replaced with European names or just numbers. Everything that made them human in European eyes was stripped away. By the late 1600s, the Dutch had established 3 separate colonies on the Guyana coast: Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice. Each colony was basically a string of plantations built along rivers. There were very few roads. Everything moved by water. The plantations grew mostly sugar, but also cotton, coffee, and tobacco. And the work was designed to extract maximum profit while providing minimum care to the workers. Enslaved people were worked like machines until they broke. A typical day started before sunrise. Enslaved people were woken by bells or horns and immediately went to the fields. They cut sugarcane with machetes in heat that could reach deadly levels. The cane had to be cut at just the right time and processed quickly or it would spoil.
They fed the cane into grinding mills, massive machines powered by water, wind, or animals that crushed the cane to extract juice. These mills could easily crush human bones if someone slipped or was pushed. After the juice was extracted, it had to be boiled in huge copper kettles over roaring fires. The boiling houses were like hell on earth. Temperatures inside reached unbearable levels. One wrong move and you fell into boiling sugar syrup and died screaming.
The work never ended. After boiling, the sugar had to be dried, packed, and prepared for shipping to Europe. Enslaved people also had to maintain the elaborate system of dams, canals, and drainage ditches that kept the swampy coastal land from flooding. The Guyana coast sits below sea level in many places. Without constant maintenance, the ocean would reclaim everything. So enslaved people dug ditches in knee-deep mud, repaired walls during rainstorms, and worked in conditions that bred malaria and other deadly diseases. They did all this while receiving barely enough food to survive. Most plantations gave workers a weekly ration of salted fish, some rice or cornmeal, and maybe plantains. It wasn't enough. Many enslaved people had to grow their own food in small garden plots during whatever few hours of rest they got, usually on Sundays. The housing was terrible. Most enslaved people lived in wooden barracks with dirt floors, no windows, and roofs that leaked when it rained. Families were often separated. Men lived in one building, women in another. Privacy didn't exist. Neither did dignity. And the punishments for any resistance or disobedience were savage and designed to terrorize. Whipping was the most common punishment. Plantation owners and overseers used whips made of twisted leather or rope that could tear flesh from bone. 50 lashes could cripple someone. 100 could kill them. But whipping was just the beginning. Enslaved people who tried to escape and were caught faced worse. Some had their Achilles tendons cut so they couldn't run again. Others had iron collars locked around their necks with long metal spikes sticking out in all directions, making it impossible to lie down or move through the forest. Some were branded with hot irons. Others were mutilated, having ears or fingers cut off as warnings to everyone else. And for serious offenses, like striking an overseer or participating in rebellion, the punishment was death, often by hanging or being burned alive in public as a spectacle to break the spirits of those watching. But the violence didn't break spirits, it hardened them. From the very beginning, from the first ships that arrived in the 1640s and 1650s, enslaved Africans resisted. Some resisted quietly. They worked slowly. They broke tools and claimed it was an accident. They pretended not to understand instructions. They poisoned livestock or set small fires. These acts of sabotage were dangerous, but they were also a way of fighting back without getting killed immediately. Other people resisted more directly. They fought overseers. They refused to work and accepted the whipping that followed. And many people ran. Running away, called marronage, started almost immediately. Some people escaped within days of arriving, before they even understood where they were or what was happening. They just knew they had to get away. Others planned for months or years, learning the layout of the plantation, figuring out which direction to run, stealing supplies, waiting for the right moment. Running was incredibly dangerous. If you were caught, you faced torture and likely death. But staying meant slow death anyway. Worked to exhaustion, beaten regularly, watching friends and family die around you. So people took the chance. They ran into the jungle. The jungle that terrified Europeans became the salvation of escaped Africans. The rainforest of Guyana is one of the densest and most dangerous environments on Earth. Trees grow so close together that walking in a straight line is impossible. Vines hang everywhere, thick as arms, covered in thorns. The ground is muddy and unstable. Rivers appear without warning, some shallow enough to wade through, others deep and filled with piranhas and caimans. Jaguars hunt silently through the trees. Poisonous snakes hide in the undergrowth. Insects swarm in clouds carrying diseases like yellow fever and malaria.
It rains constantly, violent storms that turn paths into rivers and rivers into raging floods. Europeans looked at this environment and saw certain death. They refused to go deep into the interior. Even trained soldiers with guns and supplies wouldn't venture far from the coast. But escaped Africans had no choice. They had to learn or die. And amazingly, they learned. Some of the survival skills came from Africa. Many enslaved people had been farmers and hunters in their home countries. They knew how to track animals, identify edible plants, and find water. They adapted this knowledge to a new environment. They learned which fruits were safe to eat and which would kill you. They learned to catch fish with their hands or make traps from vines. They learned to build shelters from palm leaves that kept out the rain. They learned to move quietly through the forest, leaving no trail that slave hunters could follow. But they didn't do it alone. Some escaped Africans made contact with indigenous peoples who still lived in the interior, away from European settlements. These relationships were complicated. Sometimes indigenous peoples helped escaped Africans, sharing knowledge about the land, showing them which plants could be used as medicine, teaching them how to navigate by reading the forest. Other times, indigenous peoples were hostile. The Dutch and later the British often paid indigenous peoples to hunt escaped Africans, offering guns, tools, and other goods as rewards. Some indigenous groups accepted these deals, seeing it as a way to get European goods while also keeping African settlements away from their own territories. But other indigenous groups refused and even formed alliances with escaped Africans, recognizing they had a common enemy in the Europeans. By the early 1700s, communities of escaped Africans, called Maroons, had established permanent settlements deep in the interior. These weren't just hiding spots. They were real villages with houses, farms, and organized leadership. The Maroons built their settlements in places that were almost impossible to reach. Some were on high ground, surrounded by swamps that could only be crossed by people who knew exactly where to step. Others were hidden in dense forest, far from any river the Dutch used. Some were built on islands in the middle of remote rivers. The locations were chosen for defense. If slave hunters somehow found a Maroon village, the residents needed to be able to escape or fight back. The Maroon communities grew as more people escaped. Every successful escape encouraged others to try. Plantations couldn't keep people if those people knew there was somewhere to run to. And the Maroons developed networks to help people escape. Some Maroons would sneak back to plantations at night, making contact with enslaved people still there, telling them where to run, what to bring, when to go. They created underground networks of communication. Messages were passed through songs, through drum beats, through symbols left in specific places. Plantation owners had no idea this was happening right under their noses. Life in Maroon communities was hard, but it was free. Maroons grew their own food, primarily cassava, yams, plantains, and rice. They hunted and fished. They made their own tools and weapons. They made canoes to travel the rivers. They created their own systems of government with elected or chosen leaders who made decisions for the community. They maintained African religious practices, worshiping ancestors and spirits, holding ceremonies that connected them to the cultures they'd been stolen from. They spoke Creole languages that mixed African languages with Dutch and English words. They raised children who had never been enslaved, who grew up free in the forest. But freedom came with constant danger. The Dutch colonial authorities were terrified of the Maroons. Every escaped slave represented lost property and lost profit. But worse, every Maroon community was proof that enslaved people could successfully resist and survive. This terrified plantation owners because it gave hope to people still enslaved. If others had escaped and were living free, why couldn't everyone? So the Dutch became obsessed with destroying the Maroons. They organized military expeditions into the interior, sending soldiers and armed militias to find and destroy Maroon villages. They offered huge rewards for captured Maroons, paying bounty hunters by the head whether the Maroon was brought back alive or dead. They passed brutal laws making it illegal for anyone to help escaped slaves, with severe punishments for free people or even enslaved people who assisted runaways.
But these efforts largely failed. The Dutch simply couldn't fight effectively in the jungle. Soldiers marching through the forest made noise that could be heard from far away. They got lost. They ran out of supplies. They got sick from diseases. Meanwhile, the Maroons knew every trail, every river crossing, every place to hide. They used guerrilla tactics perfected over decades. They would ambush Dutch patrols, attack quickly with arrows, spears, and whatever guns they'd stolen or traded for, and then disappear into the forest before the Dutch could organize a response. They set traps along paths, pits covered with leaves that soldiers fell into, stakes that impaled anyone who stepped wrong. They used psychological warfare, making sounds in the night that terrified European soldiers who already feared the jungle. The Maroons also raided plantations. These raids served multiple purposes. They freed more enslaved people who wanted to escape. They stole supplies, weapons, tools, gunpowder, clothing, and food. And they reminded plantation owners that they were not safe, that their control was not absolute. A Maroon raid could happen anytime, anywhere. Plantation owners lived in constant fear. Some abandoned their plantations entirely and moved to the relative safety of the coastal towns. The colonial economy suffered badly. Plantations couldn't function.
On February 23, 1763, the powder keg exploded. On Plantation Magdalenenburg, along the Congy River in Berbice, a group of enslaved Africans had reached their breaking point. The plantation owner, a cruel man who was known for savage punishments, had just ordered another round of whippings. But this time, the enslaved workers didn't submit. They fought back. They killed the overseer first, then the plantation owner and his family. They seized whatever weapons they could find, machetes, axes, a few old muskets. Then they set the plantation buildings on fire and moved to the next plantation, and the next. Within hours, the rebellion was spreading like wildfire up and down the Congy and Berbice rivers. Enslaved people on plantation after plantation rose up when they saw the fires and heard the news. They killed some Europeans and captured others. They freed everyone still in chains. They took weapons, food, boats, and supplies. The Dutch colonial authorities were completely unprepared. There were only about 300 Europeans in the entire Berbice colony, including women and children. They had a small militia and one fort, Fort Nassau, on an island in the Berbice River. As news of the rebellion reached them, panic set in. Europeans abandoned their plantations and fled to Fort Nassau or tried to escape by boat to neighboring colonies. Many didn't make it. Rebel forces controlled the rivers. They captured boats and killed or captured anyone trying to flee. Within a week, the rebels controlled almost the entire colony. Only Fort Nassau and a few coastal positions remained in Dutch hands, and even those were under siege. The Europeans trapped in Fort Nassau were terrified and running low on supplies. They sent desperate messages to Suriname and other Dutch colonies, begging for military help. But help would take weeks or months to arrive. In the meantime, the rebels were organizing themselves into an army, and they chose a leader. His name was Cuffy. We don't know everything about Cuffy's early life. He had been born in Africa, likely in the Gold Coast region, and brought to Berbice as a slave. He had worked as a cooper, someone who made barrels, which meant he had skills and likely some freedom of movement around the plantation. He was intelligent, charismatic, and respected by other enslaved people. When the rebellion started, he quickly emerged as the natural leader. Cuffy understood that this rebellion was different from previous uprisings. This wasn't just a few dozen people running to the forest. This was thousands of people, and they controlled territory. They had a chance to actually win, to drive the Dutch out completely and create their own nation. But to do that, they needed organization, strategy, and unity. Cuffy established a government with himself as the leader. He appointed other leaders to command different areas and different groups of fighters.
One of his key lieutenants was a man named Akara, a fierce warrior who led many of the military operations. Another was Atta, who helped organize the agricultural work needed to feed the rebel population. Cuffy understood they couldn't just fight. They needed to grow food, maintain the plantations they'd captured, and create a functioning society. He tried to maintain discipline among his forces, establishing rules and punishments for anyone who violated them. He wanted to prove that Africans could govern themselves, that they weren't the savages Europeans claimed they were. Cuffy also understood politics. In March 1763, he sent a letter to the Dutch governor, who was trapped in Fort Nassau. The letter was remarkable. Cuffy wrote in Dutch, demonstrating his education and intelligence. He proposed a division of the colony. The Dutch could keep the coastal areas and some plantations. Cuffy and his people would control the interior and most of the plantations. They would live side by side in peace. Essentially, Cuffy was proposing a treaty that would recognize the rebels as equals as a legitimate nation. The Dutch governor pretended to negotiate while desperately waiting for reinforcements. He sent polite letters back to Cuffy, stalling for time. He had no intention of actually making peace. To Europeans, the idea of treating Africans as equals was unthinkable. But the negotiations bought the Dutch precious weeks. Meanwhile, tensions were growing within the rebel forces. Not everyone agreed with Cuffy's leadership or his strategy. Akara, the military commander, wanted to attack Fort Nassau immediately and kill all the remaining Dutch. He argued that negotiating was a waste of time and showed weakness. Cuffy disagreed. He knew that attacking the fort would be costly. It was well defended, and they would lose many fighters. He also believed that a negotiated settlement would be more stable in the long run. But Akara saw Cuffy's caution as cowardice. The disagreement grew heated. The rebel forces began to split into factions, those loyal to Cuffy and those loyal to Akara. In April 1763, the conflict between Cuffy and Akara came to a head. They argued publicly, and their supporters nearly came to blows. The unity that had made the rebellion so successful was fracturing. Some fighters left to form their own groups. Others simply went back to the interior to join existing Maroon communities. The rebellion was losing momentum, just as Dutch reinforcements began to arrive. Ships from Suriname, St. Estephe, and even some French colonies brought hundreds of European soldiers and weapons. The Dutch also used a terrible strategy. They recruited enslaved people from other colonies, promising them freedom if they fought against the Berbice rebels. They formed units of black soldiers led by European officers and sent them into battle against their own people. The arrival of fresh troops changed everything. The Dutch began pushing back, retaking plantations one by one. The rebel forces, weakened by internal conflict and facing professional soldiers, started to lose ground. In May 1763, Dutch forces launched a major assault on rebel positions along the Berbice River. The fighting was brutal. Both sides took heavy casualties. But the Dutch had better weapons and more ammunition. The rebels, many armed only with machetes and homemade spears, couldn't hold their positions. They retreated into the interior.
Cuffy's position became impossible. His authority was challenged daily. Akara openly defied him. The dream of an independent African nation in Berbice was slipping away. In the face of these mounting pressures and the disintegration of everything he'd worked for, Cuffy made a final, tragic decision. Rather than surrender or be captured, he took his own life. The exact date isn't certain, but it was sometime in late 1763. His death marked the symbolic end of the organized rebellion, though fighting continued for months afterward. Akara took over leadership of the remaining rebel forces. He abandoned any idea of negotiation and launched guerrilla attacks against the Dutch. But without Cuffy's organizational skills and without the unity of the early rebellion, the resistance became fragmented. By early 1764, Dutch forces had retaken most of the colony. They hunted down rebel leaders systematically. Akara was eventually captured and executed in a particularly brutal public display meant to terrorize any potential future rebels. Hundreds of other captured rebels were hanged, burned alive, or broken on the wheel, a torture device where victims had their bones broken one by one until they died. The Dutch wanted to send an unmistakable message about what happened to people who dared to rebel. But here's what the Dutch never understood. They won the battle, but they didn't win the war. Thousands of rebels escaped into the interior during and after the suppression of the rebellion. They joined existing Maroon communities or formed new ones. The knowledge, experience, and weapons they brought with them strengthened the Maroons significantly. The 1763 rebellion proved something crucial. Enslaved people could fight and win, at least temporarily. They could organize, govern, and challenge European power. This knowledge spread throughout the Caribbean. The Berbice rebellion inspired other uprisings in different colonies over the following decades. In Guyana itself, the Maroon communities continued to grow and resist. The Dutch never managed to destroy them. When the British took control of the colonies in 1796 during the Napoleonic Wars and officially gained them through the Treaty of Paris in 1814, they inherited the same problem. The interior belonged to the Maroons. British authorities launched their own military expeditions into the jungle with the same dismal results the Dutch had experienced. Soldiers got lost, got sick, got killed in ambushes, and returned with nothing to show for it. The costs were enormous, and the results were zero. The Maroons developed sophisticated societies in the interior. Different communities had different systems, but most were organized around strong leaders, councils of elders, and communal decision-making. They maintained African cultural practices mixed with new traditions born from their unique situation. They practiced traditional African religions alongside Christianity, which some had been exposed to on plantations. They created their own music, art, and oral histories that passed down stories of escape, survival, and resistance.
These weren't just survival camps. They were real civilizations, built in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Maroon children learned to hunt, identify medicinal plants, navigate by the stars, and fight using guerrilla tactics. This knowledge was passed down carefully because survival depended on it. The British tried everything to destroy the Maroons. Military campaigns failed. Amnesty programs were rejected. The Maroons understood their survival depended on staying united and staying free. After emancipation in 1838, many freed people moved inland near Maroon settlements. Communities merged over time, but the spirit of resistance never disappeared. Descendants of Maroons maintained fierce independence throughout the 1800s and 1900s. In 1966, Guyana gained independence. The new nation declared Cuffy a national hero. February 23rd became Republic Day, the anniversary of the 1763 rebellion. In 1976, a statue of Cuffy was unveiled in Georgetown, showing him holding a torch and a broken chain, symbols of freedom and liberation. Today, descendants of Maroons live throughout Guyana, especially along the rivers. They maintain cultural practices, tell stories of resistance, and practice spiritual traditions blending African and indigenous influences. Their music echoes West Africa, but is uniquely Guyanese. The Maroon story isn't ancient history, it's living history that shapes Guyana today. The Maroons proved that enslaved people were not victims waiting to be saved. They were fighters who took their freedom by force and defended it for generations. They built societies in the jungle that outlasted empires. They raised children who never knew chains, and they showed the world that no system of oppression, no matter how brutal, can completely destroy the human desire for freedom. The legacy of Cuffy and the Maroons lives on, not just in Guyana, but everywhere people continue to fight against injustice. Their story reminds us that freedom is never given freely. It must be taken and defended, sometimes for centuries, sometimes at terrible cost, but it's always worth fighting for. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from history. Drop a comment below and let me know what historical topic you want covered next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.